Welcome to Through the Word, a podcast series connected to our current Sunday sermons. Join us as we explore the book of Romans. Well, welcome back to episode 2 in this series from the book of Romans. You may remember from the first episode that we were talking about the righteousness of God, and there was a bit of an uptick in the thought that we could receive from Christ the gospel, the good news of righteousness that's not our own. And here we are in the second message. Josh, you just preached about this in the second message, which kind of goes dark. And it says that everyone in the world should understand who God is, because it says here it's plain to them, and yet there's a darkness here. And so how does this work, and what does it mean that it's plain to us if so many in the world really don't seem to understand?
When it says, verse 19, since what may be known about God is plain to them, Romans 1:19. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. Well, we might say, well, how? Paul does so great at doing this sort of raising and answering questions, this sort of rhetorical device. He says, well, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what's been made, so that people are without excuse. So he's saying, just look at the world around you. It's not here by accident. There's no way. People have always known. It couldn't possibly be here by accident. There's an order to creation that couldn't possibly be accidental. For all these things to come together so that there's a rhythm and there's harmony and life can actually continue to go forward, we know that there must be a God. And so it speaks here specifically about his eternal power, a God powerful enough to make all of this bigger than our universe, which we can't find the end of. Even though we're seeing how many hundreds and thousands of light years off into the distance, and we can't find the end of the universe. So his eternal power to make something so big, his divine nature, he is God. We are not. That's obvious. It's clear, this says. God made it clear, built into his design, made it clear by what's been made. So we can know those things about God. We ought to know those things about God. And there is a sense, this is saying, in us, humanity, that we do know those things about God.
Well, it says verse 21, all right? For although they knew God,
that's right,
they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him. So is it enough that anyone in this world could recognize there is a God by looking out at the trees and the ocean and the beauty of nature? Is it enough? Or is there something more that's needed for salvation? So
great
we
question.
often talk about general versus special revelation of God. How does this work in to the gospel and to our understanding of salvation?
One of the passages that people regularly go to sort of teach what you've just mentioned, the idea of general and special revelation, is Psalm 19. It starts off just by saying, like, the heavens declare the glory of God. If we look up at the sky, it declares the glory of God. Without speech, it's like pouring forth speech, telling us all about who God is. But then in verse 7, it says that the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving my soul. The testimony of the Lord is sure, making wise is simple. And it's just pointing to this reality that God is so immense and beautiful, and we can see that through the creation. But his law is such a gift to us in that it is pure and it revives our souls. It is perfect and brings us to life. That there's something about us that needs something extra. I love, like, in Matthew 11, Jesus has been walking around disclosing who God is to the world. This is the Son of God made incarnate, walking around revealing who the Father is. But then he starts to, like, heap woes on those who have rejected him. They've experienced, like, general, like, it's supernatural revelation and rejected him. But then Jesus says this, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and learned, and revealed them to little children. Yes, Father, for this is what you are pleased to do. All things have been committed to me by my Father. No one knows the Son except the Father, and no one knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him. It's almost like Jesus is saying, all have seen, all have enough proof to say yes to God. But unless Jesus chooses to give them that extra sort of special revelation that they need to bring what is dead to life, they are going to repress the truth?
Yeah.
Sounds like a mystery that's impossible to figure out.
Well, certainly who Jesus chooses to reveal, like we would say, is certainly mysterious or why. But it is clear that it requires Jesus to reveal that to us for our hearts to become enlivened to this truth about who God truly is.
Yeah, so you're asking, is there enough in what God has revealed of himself through creation for us to be saved? And as Matt says, now on the one hand, no, because Christ has to reveal enough to us that we understand who Christ is and we're saved. And further, we might say...
Because we're not saved by creation.
Right.
For sure.
Right?
Yeah.
We're saved by the person of Christ.
Yeah.
And we have to know who he is.
That's right, yeah.
Okay.
And we might go back to what Romans 1 is saying here, and we say, what does it say we can know about God? Can we know everything about God through the world he's created? It doesn't say that. Mm-hmm. It says his eternal power and his divine nature are what we can see. Right. Does that mean those are the only things we can see about God by what he's created? No, it doesn't mean that either necessarily. I think we could see his loving providence, that things, the rhythms are as they are, and we receive food and season and all those things. There's probably a lot more we could deduce, but Romans just points out, Romans 1, these couple of things, his eternal power and his divine nature. Now, what does Romans say then was expected from us because we could see those things? And by the way, it says God made them plain. Mm-hmm. So those aren't things that we're supposed to need this special revelation of. We're supposed to be able to just see it. It's plain. It's right there. You don't need to be an academic. You don't need somebody to give you, you don't have to have a degree in theology or any of those things. Our kids look at the world around them and know there has to be something bigger. There's got to be a God. Yeah. It's along the way that we start to suppress that, but we may come to that in a minute. What is expected then from us that God has made this plain? Oh, well, it says that we should give him worship, glory and thanks. Yep. So the fact that we don't give him thanks and we don't give him glory, even though we look around and we can see, boy, there's got to be a God, and he's my whole reason for life and everything I've got. And now we're accountable for that. Mm-hmm. So there is enough revealed to us that we are accountable and actually righteously judged for the fact we don't give glory and thanksgiving to God. But not enough in and of just creation itself that we can say, oh, I know how to be saved. That's why it's so critical that we act on the obligation we talked about last time and bring the gospel to the world around us. How can they know unless we go and we preach and we tell them, and Paul will get to that later in Romans too.
So as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, there's a darkness here in this section of Romans 1.
It's heavy.
Because we have this idea that we should understand who God is and we should naturally gravitate the right direction, but we somehow don't. And then we have this really heavy term in verse 18, the wrath of God is being revealed. Yeah. So let's talk about that. What is that?
Yeah.
What does it mean? How does it work its way through our world?
There's a lot of conversation about what the Bible means when it speaks of the wrath of God. And I think it's very important for us to understand that we might think of wrath as a human response where someone is capricious, where they have lost control, where they're just exploding in uncontrolled anger on someone else, and we call that wrath.
Rage.
And rage, great synonym. That's not God's wrath. His wrath is not out of control. It is in fact his measured, holy response to unrighteousness and sin and its effects on his good creation and its really offense against him as creator. So it's important we start there, that we understand his wrath is not that sort of uncontrolled rage, but instead a measured, holy response. What more would you say, Matt, about wrath?
Yeah, so with God's wrath, we just talked about last week about the revelation of God's righteousness. And I think you've rightly said that in some ways, the wrath of God is just an applied sense of his holiness, that he is morally perfect, he is morally righteous. And so that eternal characteristic of God then applied or appropriated in creation against those who reject his righteousness and holiness. who reject his moral standard, is then experienced as wrath. So there's this fella from the early church, Didymus the Blind. He writes commentary on Zechariah. And in that commentary, he talks about how God extends to his people his righteousness and holiness and his love, his compassion, his grace. But there are those who have hard hearts. And when those very characteristics of God, which to those who have soft hearts, willing to be turned by God's love towards him, the same love and compassion and grace and righteousness that turns a heart towards God, that is ready to be moved, the one that is obstinate, it sort of, instead of turning bold face against God, is almost like compressed and hardened. And I think you see this idea when in verse 21, Paul says that those who reject God, who reject the one who has revealed himself so clearly in the world, they become futile in their thinking. They lose the capacity to do the very thing that God created us to do with rationality. And then their foolish hearts were darkened. And I just get this picture of the heart that continues to reject God becoming harder and harder and harder over time. And this leads to futile thinking and futile desires, futile loves.
Yeah, that's great, Matt. Sometimes theologians refer to this as the noetic effects of sin. And where we see hints of the noetic effects of sin in our passage. Well, first let me explain. Noetic, it doesn't mean Noah, noetic. Mm-hmm. Noetic as in referring to understanding, ability to comprehend and make meaning of things. And so the noetic effects of sin is really saying here in our passage, well, God has made himself plain. We have chosen to embrace a lie, to suppress the truth, and God gives us over to that. That, in effect, is an expression of his wrath. He gives us over to this thing that we've chosen, so that he says then in verse 21, their thinking became futile. Their foolish hearts were darkened. We think we understand the world around us. We're so sure that we're clear on it, but we embraced a lie. God gives us over to the lie. Our thinking becomes futile. And then verse 22 says, they claimed to be wise, but they became fools. So we can't make sense of this world around us. It's part of our depravity with sin's effects on this world.
And is that also then part of verse 25? Another effect is that we serve and worship created things rather than the Creator himself.
Yeah.
Is that one of those effects or a cause, I suppose, of the wrath of God coming on?
All wrapped up together, for sure. And the wrath of God there being giving us over to a number of different things in this passage. So he's giving us over to this brokenness of our thinking. He's giving us over to our own desires and our hearts that actually are all twisted and backwards and make no sense. But he gives us over to that, to the point that by the time we come to the end of chapter 1, we're not only falling headlong into all of this, and this will be next week's passage, but we're celebrating it. So yeah, worshiping and serving created things. How crazy! Like we can have God, we can have the Creator, and we settle for the created things, and then elevate those created things as though they're worthy of exaltation and worship and glory, rather than giving that glory and that thanksgiving and exaltation to the God that we know is there. He made himself plain, plenty plain enough that we would give him those things.
This is the type of thing that happens because God is revealing himself, making himself known through natural revelation. That the material realm is sort of like God's medium or means through which he reveals himself to us. When we reject the God who's revealing himself, that spiritual revelation of who God is through the means, the material means, all that we're left with is the material means now. And we begin worshiping things like the sun or the moon or the stars. We begin sort of like putting our hope in rocks. We think that we can somehow manipulate material things as we give ourselves to them. And like in some ways, I think a lot of us as Christians were blind to the realities. We've become a little futile in our thinking maybe about how we expect sort of very material goods in our world to give us what ultimately only God can do. And we begin to enjoy things in themselves, for themselves, instead of doing what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10, to do all things to the glory of God, to use material means to then praise God, instead of just enjoying those things as ends in themselves.
So what does that look like, guys? As we think about, most people who are listening to this podcast are probably not worshiping the literal sun or worshiping trees or rivers or things like that. There may be some, but the majority of people in our culture, and certainly those that would be exposed to this podcast, would say, that's not me, I don't do that, and I don't know a lot of people who do that. How do we worship and serve created things?
I think it's anything that takes the primacy place in your life. I think maybe for some people it's education. I'm going to keep getting more degrees until I understand all there is to know, and I'll feel like I'm sufficient in myself then. Maybe that's God for some people.
Sometimes I think it's helpful for us to think of the things that we've destroyed in our lives, because we've placed the weight of God upon them, right? The expectation that they would be God. I think a lot of people today do that with relationship. They find a significant other who they think is going to be the answer to all of their life, and they crush them because that is a severe weight nobody can handle. Or we think that our finances are going to do that, or our job is going to do that. Whatever it is that we think can hold the weight of the meaning of our lives. Certainly we destroy it. So it's a good test. Have I ever destroyed
What have I been
this?
destroying?
Because I've trusted in that sort of way.
Yeah, that's great. And by the way, with the relationships, you're right. There are people doing that right now that are listening to this podcast. They may not be worshiping the sun, but they're destroying their relationships by effectively worshiping their significant other or their children. There are a lot of people crushing their children by putting on them a weight that is akin to a worship that your kid was never made to be able to carry. And so we have to be very careful of that. If we think of the word worship, it has this idea of worth-ship tied up in its origins, right? And so what is worth? What is worthy of all of my pursuits and my accolades? And so it can really be anything in life, can't it, that we chase as being worthy of our chasing, worthy of our pursuit, worthy of us giving to this thing, whether it be our time or our talents or our treasures or our touch. And it can take a lot of different manifestations. It's oftentimes in our present culture, we worship the pursuit of greatness in sports in our kids' lives, don't we? People do this. The amount that's sacrificed in the name of what maybe our kid will become as a baseball player or a hockey player one day.
The religious words of sacrifice.
That's right. That was intentional. That was intentional.
That's key.
The amount that we sacrifice in the name of experience to go and taste and see everything that the world has to offer. Solomon did, by the way. He said it was meaningless. But we worship all kinds of things in ways that are not the literal bowed down before the tree and said, "You are my God," or carved a graven image out of a stone and said, "You are my God." But we have taken something God created, everything we can see and feel and touch in this universe we've created, and then beyond that, because the spiritual things are all realities created by God as well, but we take something that God has created and we elevate it and we say, I think that's worthy. And now we've given our worship away to someone other than the God who made himself plain and the only one worthy of it.
So the end of verse 25 is a good place to stop, I think, today. So what's the antidote? Remember, God is the only one who is forever praised. There's a little doxology right here, a little ending to that phrase in verse 25. The wrath of God, this whole section, we should know better, but we don't. It's poured out on us. Our hearts are darkened. Our minds are darkened. But here's a reminder, only God is forever praised. So there's a good reminder for us as we leave this episode today. Worship the Lord only and serve him only. Again, we'd love to chat with you further. If you have any questions, come and talk to one of us. And God bless you. Keep studying, keep growing, keep learning, and we will grow together in the Lord. God bless. For more episodes, find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Emmanuel Plus on YouTube.